Imagine being on the verge of marrying the love of your life, but having a doubt that won't let you rest. Does she love you for who you are or for what you have? This is the story of Richard, a millionaire who decided to test his fiancée's love in an unusual way, and what he discovered changed everything. Enjoy the story. Richard and Amber had been together for 3 years. They met at a charity event and since then had been inseparable. Richard was a successful businessman, owner of a vast fortune, while Amber was a hard-working and dedicated young woman from a middle-class background. Despite their evident love, Richard always harbored a small doubt in his heart. Did Amber love him for himself or for his money? With this doubt gnawing at his mind, Richard decided to take drastic action. He confided his plan to his best friend, Mike. "Richard, you're crazy. Disguising yourself as a homeless man to test Amber. This could ruin everything," Mike exclaimed. But Richard was determined. "I know, Mike, but I need to be sure. I can't enter this marriage with that doubt. If she loves me for who I am, she will accept me even as a homeless man. If not, it's better to find out now than later." Richard spent days planning every detail. He traded his elegant suits for dirty, torn rags, donned a scruffy wig, and smeared his face with charcoal to look more convincing. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to uncover the truth. Disguised as a homeless man, Richard positioned himself on the sidewalk in front of the building where Amber worked in Manhattan. He held a sign asking for help and watched people pass by. When Amber exited the building, he timidly called out to her, "Excuse me, miss, could you please help me? I'm hungry and have nowhere to sleep." Amber looked at him with disdain and replied, "Sorry, I don't have anything to give you." Richard felt a pang of pain in his heart but didn't give up. In the following days, Richard continued trying to approach Amber, but she always ignored him or treated him coldly. He began to lose hope, but knew he had to stick to the plan. Each encounter left Richard more disheartened. He started to question whether he was doing the right thing, but he knew he had to see it through. This story of love, betrayal, and redemption will surprise you at every turn. Prepare for an emotional journey that will make you reflect on the true meaning of love and trust. Keep watching to find out what happens when Richard finally reveals the truth to Amber. Will their love survive this extreme test? Richard Rockefeller, one of New York's most successful businessmen, was sitting in his luxurious office atop a skyscraper in Manhattan. His green eyes, usually filled with confidence, now reflected deep concern. He absent-mindedly twirled the engagement ring he intended to give to Amber Collins, his girlfriend of 3 years. "Mike, I need to be sure," Richard said to his best friend and lawyer, Michael Thompson. "I can't marry her with this doubt eating away at me." Mike adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Richard, you're talking about disguising yourself as a homeless man to test Amber. That's madness. You could lose everything." Richard stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. "I know it sounds extreme, Mike, but think about it. Amber came from a middle-class family in Brooklyn. For the past 3 years, she's experienced a life of luxury she never had before. How can I be sure she loves me for who I am, not for what I have?" Mike sighed, recognizing the determination in his friend's eyes. "And how exactly do you plan to do this?" Richard smiled, a plan already forming in his mind. "I'll disguise myself as a homeless man and approach her on the streets. I'll observe how she reacts, how she treats me. If she shows compassion, if she treats me with dignity even when she thinks I'm just another beggar on the streets of New York, then I'll know her love is genuine." "And what if she doesn't show compassion?" Mike asked hesitantly. Richard's smile faded. "Then I'll have my answer. Better to find out now than after the wedding." In the following days, Richard meticulously planned every detail of his disguise. He bought old, torn clothes from thrift stores, let his beard grow, and practiced altering his voice and posture. A week later, Richard barely recognized himself in the mirror. His well-groomed hair was disheveled under a dirty wig. His tanned skin was pale and covered in fake dirt, and his designer clothes had been replaced by rags. "Remember, Mike," Richard said as he prepared to leave his apartment, "keep everything running normally. Tell everyone I'm on an extended business trip. And above all, don't let Amber suspect anything." Mike nodded, still not entirely convinced. "Be careful, Richard. The streets can be dangerous even for someone pretending to be homeless." Richard smiled, touched by his friend's concern. "Don't worry, I'll always be near Amber's office or our usual spots. If anything goes wrong, I can quickly return to my normal life." With one last look at his luxurious apartment, Richard stepped out into the streets of New York, determined to uncover the truth about Amber's love. His first stop was near the architecture firm where Amber worked. He strategically positioned himself on the sidewalk, holding a sign asking for help. His heart raced as he waited for Amber to appear. When she finally exited the building, Richard gathered all his courage. "Ma'am, please, can you help me?" he called out in a hoarse, unrecognizable voice. Amber glanced at him briefly, her face a mask of indifference. "Sorry, I don't have any change," she murmured, quickening her pace. Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. It was only the first day, he reminded himself. He couldn't jump to conclusions. In the days that followed, Richard continued his vigil, always near the places Amber frequented. Each interaction, or lack thereof, was a small stab to his heart. But he was determined to persist, convinced that he would eventually see Amber's true character. Little did he know that the following days would bring revelations that would test not only Amber's love, but also his own values and perceptions of the world. What would Richard discover on this risky journey of self-discovery? Would Amber show a more compassionate side? Don't miss the next chapter of this thrilling story of love, deception, and redemption. The sun had barely risen when Richard left the homeless shelter where he had spent the night. His back ached from the hard mattress, a constant reminder of the luxury he had left behind. He walked through the streets of Manhattan, his stomach growling with hunger, heading toward Amber's office. Positioning himself on the opposite sidewalk, Richard watched the entrance of the building. His heart raced when he saw Amber arriving, impeccably dressed in a stylish suit, a cup of expensive coffee in her hands. Gathering his courage, he approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Richard said in a hoarse voice. "Could you spare some change for a coffee?" Amber barely looked at him. "Sorry, I don't have any change," she replied coldly, walking past him without hesitation. Richard stood there, stunned by the indifference in her voice. It was as if he were invisible, insignificant. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he returned to his post, determined not to jump to conclusions. In the days that followed, Richard continued his vigil. Every morning, every lunch break, every end of the workday, he was there, watching and interacting with Amber. And each time, she ignored him or responded with increasing irritation. "You again?" she said on one particularly hot afternoon. "Look, I work hard for my money. Why don't you do the same?" Her words cut deeply into Richard. Was this the woman he planned to spend the rest of his life with? The woman he believed had a heart of gold? A week passed, and Richard began to notice changes in himself. The constant hunger, the physical discomfort, the disdainful looks from passers-by. Everything was affecting him more than he had anticipated. He found himself looking enviously at the restaurant windows, reminiscing about the lavish dinners he used to enjoy with Amber. On a rainy morning, Richard saw an opportunity. Amber exited the subway without an umbrella, clearly unprepared for the weather. Richard approached her, offering the cardboard he used as shelter. "You seem to need this more than I do," he said gently. For a moment, Richard saw a flicker of surprise in Amber's eyes, but as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the familiar expression of annoyance. "No, thank you," she replied curtly, hurrying into the office. That night, alone in the shelter, Richard reflected on his experience. He was learning a lot not only about Amber, but also about himself and society in general. The invisibility he felt, the disdain in people's gazes, the daily struggle for dignity, all of it was opening his eyes to a reality he had never truly considered before. On the 10th day of his test, Richard decided to change tactics. Instead of asking for money, he offered to carry Amber's shopping bags when he saw her exiting a department store. "No, thank you," Amber said, her voice tinged with fear. "Please leave me alone, or I'll call security." Richard stepped back, feeling defeated. He watched Amber walk away, precariously balancing her expensive bags, and felt a wave of sadness wash over him. Where was the compassionate woman he had fallen in love with? That night, lying on his hard mattress in the shelter, Richard cried silently. He wondered if this entire test had been a terrible mistake. Perhaps he was uncovering a truth about Amber that he would have preferred not to know. But a small part of him still clung to hope. Maybe Amber was just having a series of bad days. Perhaps she had had negative experiences in the past that made her distrustful. Richard decided he needed to give her more time. The next day, Richard woke up determined to continue. He positioned himself near Amber's office as usual, but this time with a new plan in mind. When Amber stepped out for lunch, Richard approached her once more. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I know you don't want to give me money and I respect that, but could you spare just 5 minutes of your time? I'd like to share my story if you're willing to listen." Amber paused, clearly surprised by this different approach. For a moment, Richard saw an internal struggle in her eyes. Finally, she sighed. "5 minutes," she said, glancing at her watch. "That's all I can give you." Richard felt a flicker of hope. He began to tell a story, not the truth about who he was, but a fictional version of how he had ended up on the streets. He spoke about losing his job, about health issues that left him in debt, about the loneliness and despair of having nowhere to go. As he spoke, Richard watched Amber's face closely. At first, she seemed impatient and skeptical. But gradually, he noticed a subtle change in her expression. Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Richard saw a glimpse of the Amber he knew and loved. When he finished his story, Amber remained silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than Richard had heard in weeks. I'm sorry for what you've been through," she said hesitantly. "I can't imagine how difficult it must be." With those words, Amber turned and walked away, leaving Richard with a mix of emotions. It had been a small moment of empathy, but would it be enough? As the sun set over the city, Richard found himself at a crossroads. He had started this test to confirm Amber's love, but now he wondered if he was discovering something much different and much more painful about the woman he planned to marry. What would the next days reveal? Would Amber show more compassion? And how would this experience change Richard? Don't miss the next chapter of this thrilling journey of love, disappointment, and self-discovery. As the days passed, Richard continued his routine as a homeless man on the streets of Manhattan, always close to Amber's workplace. Each encounter with her was a mix of hope and disappointment, testing not only Richard's patience, but also his faith in the love he believed they shared. On a particularly cold morning, Richard saw Amber arriving at work with a hot cup of coffee in her hands. Shivering from the cold, he approached her. "Please, ma'am," he pleaded. "Could you spare a sip of that coffee? I'm freezing." Amber looked at him, her eyes narrowing with irritation. "That coffee cost $5. Go buy your own," she replied coldly, walking past him without hesitation. Richard stood there, stunned by the harshness of her words. He wondered if this was really the woman he had fallen in love with. The next day, determined not to give up, Richard tried a different approach. He sat on the sidewalk with an improvised sign, "Homeless and hungry. Any help is welcome." When Amber passed by, she barely glanced at him. Richard watched as she entered a nearby deli and came out minutes later with a sandwich. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything substantial in days. To his surprise, Amber stopped near him. For a moment, Richard felt a spark of hope. Would she finally show compassion? But Amber merely tossed the used napkin from her sandwich into the trash can next to Richard and continued on her way, not even looking at him. The disappointment was palpable. Richard struggled to reconcile this cold and indifferent Amber with the loving woman he thought he knew. One day, while sitting in Central Park, Richard saw Amber walking with some friends. They were laughing and chatting animatedly, completely oblivious to his presence. Richard timidly approached the group. "Excuse me, ladies," he began. "Could you help me with some change for food?" Amber's friends seemed uncomfortable, but one of them started rummaging through her purse for some money. Amber, however, quickly intervened. "Don't give him anything," she told her friends. "These homeless people just want money for drugs and alcohol. Let's get out of here." Amber's words hit Richard like a slap. He stood there, paralyzed, as he watched them walk away. The ease with which Amber had dismissed his humanity, labeling him without even knowing him, was too painful to bear. That night, lying on his hard mattress in the shelter, Richard cried silently. He wondered if this entire test had been a terrible mistake. Perhaps he was uncovering a truth about Amber that he would have preferred not to know. Yet a small part of him still clung to hope. Maybe Amber was just protecting her friends. Perhaps she had had bad experiences in the past that made her distrustful. Richard decided he needed to give her one more chance. The next morning, he woke up determined to make one last attempt. He positioned himself near Amber's office as usual, but this time with a new plan in mind. When Amber stepped out for lunch, Richard approached her once more. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I know you don't want to give me money and I respect that, but could you spare just 5 minutes of your time? I'd like to share my story if you're willing to listen." Amber paused, clearly surprised by this different approach. For a moment, Richard saw an internal struggle in her eyes. Finally, she sighed. "5 minutes," she said, glancing at her watch. "That's all I can give you." Richard felt a flicker of hope. He began to tell a story. Not the truth about who he was, but a fictional version of how he had ended up on the streets. He spoke about losing his job, about health issues that left him in debt, about the loneliness and despair of having nowhere to go. As he spoke, Richard watched Amber's face closely. At first, she seemed impatient and skeptical, but gradually he noticed a subtle change in her expression. Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Richard saw a glimpse of the Amber he knew and loved. When he finished his story, Amber remained silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than Richard had heard in weeks. I'm sorry for what you've been through," she said hesitantly. "I can't imagine how difficult it must be." Richard felt his heart warm with those words. It was the first real sign of empathy Amber had shown since the beginning of his test. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. Amber looked at her watch and her face hardened again. "Well, your 5 minutes are up," she said, her voice returning to its usual cold tone. "I hope things get better for you." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Richard once again alone on the sidewalk. Richard stood there, confused and emotionally exhausted. For a brief moment, he had glimpsed the Amber he knew and loved. But that flash of compassion had been so quickly replaced by indifference that he didn't know what to think. Was that brief moment of empathy enough? Or was Amber's constant coldness a truer reflection of who she really was? As the sun set over the city, Richard found himself at a crossroads. He had started this test to confirm Amber's love, but now he wondered if he was discovering something much different and much more painful about the woman he planned to marry. What would Richard do now? Would he continue his test or reveal the truth to Amber? And if he decided to continue, what more would he discover about her and about himself? Dawn found Richard shivering in an alley near Amber's office. The night had been particularly cold, and he had barely slept, his body sore from the hard concrete. As he watched the first light of day, Richard wondered how much longer he could endure this test. That morning, he decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking for money or food, Richard pretended to be injured. He tore his already tattered shirt, smeared it with a bit of ketchup to simulate blood, and wrapped a dirty cloth around his head. When he saw Amber approaching, Richard began to groan in pain, clutching his side as if he were gravely hurt. "Please, help," he whispered as she passed by. For the first time in weeks, Amber stopped. She looked at Richard, hesitation clear in her eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and caution. Richard groaned again. "I was attacked. It hurts a lot. I need help." Amber looked around, clearly conflicted. Finally, she sighed and knelt beside Richard. "You need to go to a hospital. I'll call an ambulance." "No," Richard exclaimed, perhaps too forcefully. Lowering his voice, he continued, "I don't have insurance. I can't pay. I just need a place to rest for a few hours." Amber bit her lip, deep in thought. After a long moment, she spoke. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. I can help you get there." Richard felt a wave of hope. This was the first act of true kindness Amber had shown. "Thank you," he murmured, "but I don't think I can walk there." Amber hesitated again, then did something that surprised Richard. She took out her phone and called her workplace. "Hi, it's me. I won't be able to make it on time today. I have a situation here. I'll be there as soon as I can." Hanging up the phone, Amber turned to Richard. "My apartment is just a block away. You can rest there for a few hours until you feel better." Richard's heart raced. This was more than he had expected. Amber was not only showing compassion, she was putting herself in a vulnerable position to help a stranger. With difficulty, Richard got to his feet, leaning on Amber for support. Together, they slowly walked to the building where she lived. In the elevator, Richard noticed Amber looking nervously at him, probably wondering if she had made the right decision. Amber's apartment was small but cozy. Richard felt a pang of guilt as he saw pictures of them together on the walls, reminders of happier times when there were no lies between them. "You can rest on the couch," Amber said, pointing to a comfortable sofa. "I'll get a first aid kit." As Amber rummaged through the bathroom cabinet, Richard looked around the apartment. There were signs of her presence everywhere. A coat of hers hanging by the door, an extra toothbrush in the bathroom, books he knew she didn't read. Despite everything, Amber still kept these things close. Amber returned with the first aid kit and began to gently clean Richard's wound. He knew it was only a matter of time before she realized there was no real cut beneath the ketchup. But for now, he savored the moment of tenderness. "How did this happen?" Amber asked softly as she worked. Richard improvised a story about being attacked by thieves during the night. As he spoke, he watched Amber's face. There was genuine concern in her eyes, mixed with something else, guilt. "Perhaps, I'm sorry this happened to you," she said when he finished his story. "No one deserves to go through something like that." Richard nodded, feeling increasingly guilty about his lie. But he needed to see how far Amber's compassion would go. "Thank you for helping me," he said softly. "You're the first person in weeks who has shown me any kindness." Amber looked down, appearing embarrassed. I haven't been very kind to people on the streets lately. I think I've become a bit insensitive." "Why?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. Amber sighed. "It's complicated. My fiancé, he's a wonderful man, but sometimes I wonder if I'm with him for who he is, or for the life he can give me. And that makes me feel guilty, which ends up making me defensive with other people." Richard felt his heart tighten. So Amber had her own doubts and insecurities. Perhaps her previous coldness was more a reflection of her internal struggle than a lack of compassion. "I'm sure your fiancé would understand if you talked to him about it," Richard said gently. Amber gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe, but I'm afraid that if I express my doubts, he'll think I don't truly love him." Richard desperately wanted to reveal the truth at that moment, to embrace Amber and tell her that he understood, that he loved her regardless of anything. But he knew it wasn't the right time yet. As the day went on, Amber took care of Richard, offering him food, water, and a safe place to rest. She even called her workplace again, saying she would work from home to take care of her patient. As they talked, Richard saw more and more glimpses of the Amber he had fallen in love with. Kind, compassionate, funny. She shared stories about her life, her dreams, her struggles. And in every word, Richard could hear the love she had for him, even though she didn't know she was speaking to her fiancé. When night fell, Amber prepared the couch for Richard to sleep on. "You can stay here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we can look into getting some more permanent help for you." Lying on the couch that night, listening to Amber's soft breathing coming from the bedroom, Richard felt his heart swell with love and regret. He had started this test doubting Amber, but now he saw that her love was true and deep. Richard knew he had to reveal the truth soon. But how could he explain his actions without destroying the trust Amber had in him? How could he ask for forgiveness for doubting her in such an extreme way? As sleep finally enveloped him, Richard made a promise to himself. No matter what happened next, he would do everything he could to fix what he had broken and prove to Amber that his love was as true and unconditional as hers. What will happen when the truth comes to light? Will Amber be able to forgive Richard for his deception? And how will this experience change their relationship forever? Don't miss the next chapter of this thrilling story of love, forgiveness, and redemption. Dawn found Richard awake, his heart heavy with guilt and the need to reveal the truth. He heard Amber moving around in the bedroom, getting ready for the day. Each step she took made his heart race, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. Amber emerged from the bedroom, already dressed for work. She smiled gently at Richard. "How are you feeling today?" Richard sat up on the couch, gathering all his courage. "Amber, we need to talk. There's something I need to tell you." Amber's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "How do you know my name?" "I don't remember telling you." Richard took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Amber, it's me, Richard." The silence that followed was deafening. Amber froze, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What? No, it can't be. What's going on here?" Richard slowly stood up, removing the wig and wiping off the makeup that concealed his features. "I'm so sorry, Amber. I did something terrible. I disguised myself as a homeless man to test you." The words sounded absurd even to him as he said them. Amber recoiled, her expression a mix of horror, anger, and hurt. "Test you? What are you talking about? Why would you do that?" Richard tried to step closer, but Amber raised her hand, keeping him at bay. "Please, let me explain. I had doubts, insecurities about our relationship. I wanted to be sure that you loved me for who I am, not for what I have." Tears began to form in Amber's eyes. "So you decided to deceive me? To watch me? To judge me? How could you?" Guilt consumed Richard. He could see the pain in Amber's eyes, the shattered trust between them. "I know it was wrong. I deeply regret. But Amber, what I saw, the compassion you showed yesterday—" "Stop!" Amber shouted, tears now streaming down her face. "You have no idea what I've been through these past few weeks, how much I've struggled with my own feelings, my own doubts. And all this time, you were testing me?" Richard felt his heart break. He had never seen Amber so hurt, so betrayed. "I didn't know about your doubts. If I had known—" "If you had known. If you had just talked to me, Richard, that's how relationships work. With honesty, with communication. Not with tricks and tests." Amber turned away, walking to the window. She faced away from Richard, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Richard desperately wanted to embrace her, to comfort her, but he knew he had no right to do so now. "Amber, I love you more than ever. Seeing you take care of me yesterday, hearing you talk about your feelings, I realized how foolish I was to doubt you." Amber slowly turned around, her eyes red and swollen. "And what about me, Richard? Do you have any idea how I feel right now? Knowing that the man I love, the man I trusted completely, spent weeks deceiving me, watching me, judging me?" Richard lowered his head, shame consuming him. "I know what I did is unforgivable. I betrayed your trust in the worst way possible. I just hope that with time, you can forgive me." Amber looked at him for a long moment, a mix of emotions passing across her face. "I don't know if I can, Richard. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you without thinking about this lie, this betrayal." She walked to the door, grabbing her bag. I need time. I need to think. Please leave my apartment. Don't call me. Don't try to contact me. I need to process all of this." Richard nodded, knowing he had no choice but to respect her wishes. "I understand. Just know that I love you, Amber, and that I will do anything to fix this." Amber opened the door but paused before leaving. Without turning around, she said softly, "You know, Richard, I had my doubts too. I wondered if I was with you for love, or for the security you offered me. But I chose to trust us, to trust our love. I just wish you had done the same." With those words, she left, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and regrets. In the days that followed, Richard respected Amber's desire for space. He returned to his normal life, but nothing felt the same. His luxurious apartment seemed empty and cold. His business meetings felt insignificant. All he could think about was Amber and the terrible mistake he had made. Richard spent hours reflecting on his actions, his insecurities, and their relationship. He realized that his doubts were not really about Amber, but about himself. He was afraid he wasn't worthy of her love, afraid that she was only with him for his money because, deep down, he didn't believe he deserved to be loved for who he was. This revelation led him to seek professional help. Richard began therapy, working through his insecurities and trust issues. He also started getting more involved in charity work, using his experience on the streets to help people who were genuinely homeless. Weeks passed without any contact from Amber. Richard respected her desire for space, but each day without her was agony. He wondered if she would ever be able to forgive him, if they could ever rebuild what they had. Then one day, when Richard least expected it, his phone rang. It was Amber. "Can we meet?" she asked, her voice calm but cautious. Richard felt his heart leap. "Of course, whenever and wherever you want." They agreed to meet in a neutral park, a place where they both felt comfortable. When Richard arrived, he saw Amber sitting on a bench looking at the lake. She seemed tired, but there was a calmness about her that hadn't been present the last time they saw each other. Richard approached slowly, uncertain about how to proceed. Amber saw him and gestured for him to sit beside her on the bench. He sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "Thank you for coming," Amber began. I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything that happened." Richard nodded, anxiously awaiting what she would say next. "What you did hurt me deeply, Richard. It shook my trust, not only in you but in myself. It made me question every moment of our relationship." Richard felt tears forming in his eyes. "So sorry, Amber. More than I can express." Amber looked him in the eyes for the first time. "I know, and after much reflection, I understand why you did what you did. It doesn't make it right, but I understand." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I love you, Richard. Despite everything, I love you. And I want to try to fix this, but it will take time and work from both of us." Richard felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. "I'll do anything, Amber. Anything to regain your trust." Amber hesitantly took his hand. "Then let's work on this together with honesty, communication, and trust. No more tests, no more secrets." Richard gently squeezed her hand, feeling a hope he hadn't felt in weeks. "Together," he agreed. As the sun set over the park, Richard and Amber sat together talking, beginning the long process of healing and rebuilding. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew their love was worth fighting for. What does the future hold for Richard and Amber? Will they overcome this trial and build a stronger relationship? Don't miss the next and final chapter of this thrilling story of love, forgiveness, and redemption. A year passed since that day in the park. Richard and Amber worked tirelessly on their relationship, facing their fears and insecurities together. Now, finally, the day of their wedding had arrived. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was beautifully decorated, white and gold flowers adorning every pew. Guests began to arrive, filling the space with a buzz of anticipation. In the back of the cathedral, in a small room, Richard nervously adjusted his tuxedo. Mike, his best friend and best man, stood beside him. "Are you okay, man?" Mike asked. Noticing Richard's tension, Richard took a deep breath. "I am, it's just that after everything we've been through, I sometimes still can't believe we've made it this far." Mike smiled, giving his friend a reassuring pat on the back. "You two have been through a lot, but look where you are now. This is true love, Richard." Richard nodded, a smile forming on his lips. "You're right, I just hope that—" Before he could finish, there was a knock at the door. It was the priest, informing them that it was time. On the other side of the cathedral, in another room, Amber was radiant in her wedding dress. Her best friend Emily was making the final touches to her hair. "You look beautiful, Amber," Emily said, her eyes shining with emotion. Amber smiled, but there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "Thank you, Em. I still have moments where I wonder." Emily took her friend's hands. "Hey, look at me. You and Richard have been through something that would have destroyed most couples, but you chose to fight for your love. That's special, Amber. It's rare." Amber nodded, feeling tears welling up. "You're right. I love him so much, Em, more than ever." The music began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony. Richard walked down the aisle, his heart pounding, when the doors opened and Amber appeared, radiant and beautiful. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. As Amber walked down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Richard, they both recalled the journey that had brought them here. The doubts, the test, the pain of betrayal, and the long road of healing and forgiveness. When Amber reached the altar, Richard took her hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The priest began the ceremony, but before he could go too far, Richard gently interrupted him. "Excuse me, Father," Richard said, his voice trembling slightly. "Before we continue, there's something I need to say." He turned to the guests, still holding Amber's hands. "A year ago, I made a terrible mistake. Driven by fear and insecurity, I tested Amber's love in the worst possible way." A murmur ran through the congregation. Amber squeezed Richard's hands, encouraging him to continue. "I disguised myself as a homeless man, spent weeks on the streets, watching Amber, testing her compassion. It was wrong, it was cruel, and it almost destroyed what we had." Richard turned to Amber, tears now streaming freely down her face. "Amber, you had every right to leave me that day, to never look at me again. But you chose forgiveness. You chose love." Amber was crying now too, a tremulous smile on her lips. "In the past months," Richard continued, "I've learned more about love, trust, and forgiveness than I have in my entire life. I've learned that true love doesn't need tests. It endures. It perseveres. It grows even in the toughest moments." Turned again to the guests. "I'm sharing this with all of you today, not to boast or seek absolution, but so that everyone knows how extraordinary this woman I'm about to call my wife is, and so that everyone can witness the commitment I make today." Richard looked deeply into Amber's eyes. "Amber, I promise to never doubt your love again. I promise to trust you, to trust us, even in the hardest times. I promise to be honest always, even when it's difficult. Above all, I promise to love you, respect you, and cherish you every day of my life." Amber, with tears in her eyes, smiled and said, "Richard, when you revealed the truth that day, I thought our love was over. But over the months, as we worked on our relationship, I realized that true love is about growing together, learning from mistakes, and choosing each other every day." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I forgave you not because what you did was right, but because I saw how willing you were to change, to grow. I saw the man I love fighting not just for me, but for us. And it's with that man that I want to spend the rest of my life." The priest, visibly moved, resumed the ceremony. When it came time for the vows, both Richard and Amber spoke from the heart, promising love, fidelity, and above all, mutual trust. "By the power vested in me," the priest finally said, "I declare you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Richard pulled Amber in for a passionate kiss, as the cathedral erupted in applause and cheers. When they pulled away, both were smiling, their faces radiant with happiness. At the reception that followed, Richard and Amber danced, laughed, and celebrated with their loved ones. But in a quiet moment, Richard pulled Amber aside. "I have a surprise for you," he said, his eyes sparkling. "More surprises?" Amber teased, raising an eyebrow. Richard laughed. "This one you're going to love, I promise." He handed her an envelope. Amber opened it, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "Richard, this is a donation in our name," he completed, "to create a support and rehabilitation program for homeless people. I thought it would be an appropriate way to turn our mistake into something positive." Amber hugged him tightly, tears of joy in her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. As they returned to the party, hand in hand, Richard and Amber knew they had a long road ahead. There would be challenges, doubts, and difficult moments, but now they would face it all together, with love, trust, and the certainty that no matter what happened, they would choose each other every day. And so, under the starry sky of New York, Richard and Amber danced, celebrating not only their wedding but the journey that had brought them here. A journey of love, forgiveness, and above all, growth. And so, our emotional story comes to an end. What an exciting journey we have just witnessed, right? Richard and Amber's story takes us on a roller coaster of emotions, making us reflect on love, trust, and forgiveness. Let's think together. What does this story teach us about relationships? First, we see how a lack of communication can lead to misguided decisions. Richard, driven by his insecurities, opted for an elaborate test instead of openly talking to Amber. How many times in our own lives do we let fear speak louder and avoid difficult conversations? But the story also shows us the power of forgiveness. Amber, even deeply hurt, chose to give her relationship a second chance. She recognized that true love sometimes means working hard to overcome obstacles, and we cannot forget Richard's journey of self-discovery. Through his experience on the streets, he not only tested Amber but also confronted his own insecurities and prejudices. This reminds us that personal growth is a crucial part of any healthy relationship. Now, I want to hear from you. Which part of the story touched your heart the most? Was it the moment Amber showed compassion for the homeless Richard? Or perhaps Richard's emotional speech at the altar? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you identified with Richard and Amber's struggles, know that you are not alone. Relationships are complicated, full of ups and downs. But it is often in difficulties that we find our strength and grow as individuals and as a couple. This story also reminds us of the importance of looking beyond appearances. Richard, disguised as a homeless man, experienced firsthand what it's like to be invisible to society. This makes us think, how do we treat those we encounter on the streets? Do we, like Amber initially, pass by them without a second glance? Remember, every person has a story, struggles, and dreams. Compassion and empathy can make all the difference in someone's world. Now, if this story touched your heart, if it made you laugh, cry, or reflect, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these exciting and inspiring stories to you. Every subscription, every like, every comment motivates us to keep doing what we love. And it doesn't stop here. We have many more incredible stories waiting for you on our channel. How about checking out our next video? It's another equally thrilling story about, well, I won't spoil the surprise. Just click the link that appears on the screen now. Remember, every story we share here is an opportunity to learn, grow, and connect with one another. So let's keep this conversation going. Share your own experiences, your reflections, your stories in the comments. Thank you for being here, for feeling with us, for being part of this amazing community. Until the next video, and remember, true love overcomes all obstacles, but only when we choose to trust, forgive, and grow together. Until next time, and don't forget, like, subscribe, and hit the bell to not miss any of our exciting stories.